Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 220 and Happy New Year to everyone. This is the first episode of 2023 and I've got a very special guest today, the Plyo guy, Matt McInnes Watson. Matt, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for calling me special. I've never been called special on a podcast before.
No, I'm just saying before we started recording, I've followed the work that you put out since you were on David Gray's podcast. And ever since listening to that, which I've listened to a couple of times, I was like, I need to get Matt on and have a chat and just relate it to football and suck out as much information as we can from you. So that's my aim of the podcast. But I really appreciate you coming on and doing it because I know you've got quite a bit going on at the moment.
No, I appreciate you having me on. It's always nice to go onto a different podcast and speak to different communities. And I always find this as a way for me to like constantly develop what I think my knowledge is, or where I can fit my knowledge into different spaces. And football is primarily my first love anyway. It's what I grew up playing, so it's always nice to kind of come back to that and be like, yeah, I feel like I understood football as a youngster. So seeing things now from a different kind of lens and perspective, just in terms of the journey that I've been on, and then coming back to football, it is always nice to do that. So I appreciate you having me on.
No, not at all. Matt, just with that in mind, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah. So I'm now primarily a coach, performance kind of consultant, if you want to call it that. It's I help coaches and I help athletes all over the place, whether it's from football, American football, basketball, ice skating, almost kind of anything that is relatively dynamic and powerful, and that's come from a background of me being primarily a high jumper when I was, I'd say, in my kind of athletic prime. Although I'm only 31, I feel like that was my prime, and I'm not so much there anymore. So having a daughter this year definitely shows that I'm not in my prime now. So yeah, and that's really guided a background of high jump, and the coaching and mentoring that I had from my coach within athletics and track and field has really guided me to develop the skills, push me towards the educational things that I wanted to learn when it comes to power, speed, plyometric training in general. And it's really having a bit of a niche in that areas has opened a lot of doors for me to show I do have other skills in being able to coach strength conditioning based stuff. And I would never say I'm necessarily a skills based coach when it comes to any individual sport apart from track and field. But again, people might argue that there's not many skills in comparison to what you would see in football. But we have the specific demands of our sport as well, and track and field is my domain in that. So yeah, and I became a high jumper because I got a little bit sick of football. There was too much of it in my life. My dad kind of drove football into me from a young age, and I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that are probably the same. And I just got to a stage where I got to sixth form college in the UK, and I was like, I wanted to try something different. And my friend said to me, "Oh, have you tried basketball?" I got into basketball through dunking a basketball the first time I'd ever really tried it. Found out that you need to start basketball probably the same age that I started football, and not at 17. Because I found out quickly that I was just an athlete running up and down the court, doing, the dirty work or athletic based stuff like jumping a lot, diving on balls and stuff. So that transitioned into me being introduced to high jump when I was 18, which again, you could say is potentially a bit too old to start a sport. But yeah, I kind of had a career that should have been, would have been, could have been sort of thing. And yeah, it developed me becoming a coach. I was speaking to someone yesterday actually about this. I think I always had a coach's mentality in me, where I would have a training group around me, and I was always looking at people and trying to help them. I was always like, if the coach wasn't there in that given moment, trying to help others, trying to solve problems for them. And that's kind of led me to where I am now. it led to my coach retiring, me then taking over that responsibility of the training group that we had, me retiring and then becoming the coach of that group. And then, yeah, I moved into S&C stuff, and now running a business that's primarily kind of educational. We do offer a lot of programs as well, but yeah, just trying to guide other people through that lens that I think is really valuable from learning about physical movement in track and field, and seeing how you can take some of that and put it into sports like football or pitch invasion based games.
I think there's a lot of lessons there already for people around. Obviously, you've now got a business, but that's come from a natural sort of interest and intrigue into an area, hasn't it? So I think there's a lot, because I think people go the other way, don't they? They think, I've got to have a business, I've got to have a company. What's it going to be? Rather than it being sort of naturally developing from what you've done.
Yeah, do you know what? And it was really, really a case of, like, I started to, I think it was probably about 6 months before the big COVID hit. I had a guy that I was helping out with, and he's big in like the basketball dunking community online, and runs his own business, and had done so for about a year. And I was helping him with some plyometrics and speed and power stuff. And he said, "You've got such a lot of information that people don't necessarily have that." It's not necessarily they didn't have that knowledge, but they didn't have that kind of point of view or angle to look at plyometrics and dynamic movement from. There was the traditional kind of jumping on and off of boxes stuff that everyone kind of recirculated. And he said, he kind of pushed me to look into putting together some education and programs for people. So yeah, it was someone else that was driving that for me, rather than, like you say, right now there's this like, I'm going to start a coaching business, and you're like, well, what's your niche? Do you have a niche?
Yeah.
Maybe you should find that niche. What's needed in that niche? What's missing in football right now? I'm sure there's a lot of coaches that will listen to this and say, what do we not have in football that could add real value? Is it return to play stuff? Is it speed stuff? Is it change of direction? Change of direction, I think, is the next gold mine in invasion sport, and in systematizing that for coaches, I think is going to be really valuable. But I found that there weren't many plyo people out there. There weren't that many. And it just so happened to be that I had 12, 13 years of doing plyos myself, and then taking some of that into coaching those plyos, and then seeing, the rewards that people were getting off the back end of it. So yeah, it's it happened quite naturally for me to do that, and it was almost like, okay, how do I go about doing this, and figuring out ways to do that as a business.
Yeah, so that's what I like about like stories similar to yours, is that that's where the best businesses are created. I think that it's come from that natural progression. With that in mind, Matt, around the business, because you mentioned courses and support for coaches and athletes, how does that actually look sort of day to day, or what sort of experience do people get from the business?
So we have our first initial offering was a membership that offered basically as many kind of sports programs as you can think of in terms of a plyometric like insert. So it's like a supplement to what you might be doing in the gym, what you might be doing on the pitch, speed work. It was plyos where people could realistically do plyometrics anywhere. Like, we have people all over the world. Like, the best example is the athletes that we have in the Philippines that literally are just out on their street. They had bad weather, somewhere that's dry, and they could do plyometrics on the flat, move dynamically, and develop over a period of time. And we've scaled everything so that we have, starter, intermediate, advanced programs, return to play based movement stuff as well, which I think is really, really important, because we had that kind of divide at the moment, and I still see it so much. We go from real clinical rehabilitational stuff to, oh, we're back to where we were before.
Yeah.
And my I think what's becoming more obvious to me is how much more value I can almost bring to that sector of performance, in comparison to maybe like the icing on the top sort of like being more dynamic and powerful and explosive. It's actually bridging the gap between, static rehab to dynamic performance-based work. So yeah, we have this big offering of all these different programs, and people can come and grab and go what they want. And And I think that also the unique part of it is that I filmed all the movements myself. So you've got someone that, you know, has a large background in that, and has done it for a long period of time, so people can visually say, that's how I've got to do it. That's the intent that I need in that movement. And we've scaled a system that kind of moves from really rudimentary movements to really dynamic stuff, to movements that aren't necessarily plyometrics and in inverted commas, that are more kind of deeper range of motion and yielding based actions. Yeah, and that kind of led to me writing the course at the beginning of this year, which is an introduction to coaching plyometrics. And it gives you basic science, it gives you the skills to program, then it gives you the skills to test and to track data and to see whether what you're doing is impacting your athletes. And yeah, and it's kind of organically grown over the last, I'd say 18 months. It's really started to move in the direction that we want it to. And now we're doing face-to-face seminars. Did one in Ireland in November, and now doing one in New York and London in February. So, and it's kind of based around the course in terms of how I deliver it, but it also has the practical element, which people, if you haven't seen someone move in a dynamic nature that's maybe from the track and field community, you start to open your eyes like, oh, okay, this is how athletes can move. So, and I think that's a really valuable part is that visual and aesthetic and sound as well. So hearing someone hit the ground effectively, you're like, oh, okay, that's dynamic movement. It's not what I thought it was when I'm trying to get my athletes to move. Okay, this is where I'd like my athletes to be, sort of thing. So yeah, it's really moving quite well. So yeah, I appreciate the question.
No, one thing I was going to say from the start is obviously we're going to have a discussion about numerous different topics on the podcast, but I would say go and follow the work that you do, because visually you take a lot more, don't you, from what the content that you're putting out, and especially the way that you do it as well. I think it's great. There's so much value in there. Well, hopefully we'll get that aligned with the conversations we're going to have today. But obviously it's a skill, isn't it, that you need to see. And like you say, there's a lot of things to be taken away from actual seeing the videos. So I would say to people, make sure you go and follow and look at some of the content and work that you're putting out there as well. You mentioned just before about sort of defining plyometrics. This must be something that you talk about 100 times a day, but the definition of plyos, can you just start us on that? What are plyometrics and what is just jump training or dynamic movements?
Yeah. Yeah, you say you must have said it a few times. I have said it a few times, but I will continue to beat the drum until, you're bleeding from the ears, sort of thing, until we get this built into our eyes and ears. But plyometrics to me is a movement that has a landing and a takeoff in the sequence of action. And when it's pretty fast, if you were to say, oh, that movement looks fast, what they're doing is fast, is probably quite plyometric. That is, for me, the easiest way to describe a plyometric. You can bring in all these fancy words like the stretch shortening cycle, like elasticity, being reactive. If it looks fast to the eye and there's a landing and a takeoff, to me, it's plyometric. We have a lot of research to suggest that when we have a landing portion to a jumping based action, we are able to increase the amount of force that we're going to be receiving on the body. If you're to start from a static motion and you're trying to create momentum from like a counter movement jump, we know straight away that it doesn't have the forces that you get with a landing. And in doing so, we call upon our tendons, and our tendons are our best friends when it comes to dynamic movement and locomotion, because in doing so, we hold the muscle in a little bit more of a static isometric pose, rather than trying to like lengthen and shorten it in a kind of in a slow action. When we pull on that tendon, and the tendon has to do that tug, well, we get really dynamic, reactive, elastic kind of responses from the tendon. And also we get quite a lot more reflexive kind of, you could almost class it as free energy. It's not muscular based effort. So we have that landing and takeoff portion. It's relatively fast. It's probably plyometric. We can go into ground contact times. which is very broad in the way that it's talked about. We assume that this 0.25 is our golden kind of zone of plyometrics. If you're to creep over into 0.26, does that make it not plyometric? I know you could say that there needs to be a boundary, but it's still probably relatively fast. But we've had one researcher that said that time, which was Schmidt-Bleacher back in the early 90s, late 80s, and we haven't had anything to kind of renew that, or anyone to really say anything different. But again, we do have research to support that anything that crosses over the 0.3 for a landing and takeoff uses less of the tendon. The more time we spend on the ground, the more yield we're likely to get around a range of around a joint, and that range of motion is to be larger in terms of the depth that you might fall into a jump. So if you to imagine you're to fall, land on 2 feet, if you're to compress the whole body and drop your bum to your heels, the likelihood is that's going to become much more muscular in terms of the effort that's driven. Whereas if you're to land and overcome that and you're really stiff, you're going to get a real pop off of the floor. And that pop is going to come from the tendons, as we spoke about before. Yeah, so that's how I see plyometrics.
100%. You've also mentioned before about athletes working around the world with no equipment, essentially, and that's what comes across on a lot of your content is that there isn't much equipment used. It's you in the ground, essentially. When you go into gyms right across the football world, you see all these hurdles, you see boxes, and obviously there's a time and a place for those to be used. Not saying to take those out, but do you feel like they're potentially overused and maybe taking us away from what we're actually trying to achieve if plyometrics are the aim?
Yeah. My good friend Chris Speed messaged me yesterday. He was like, "Why do people buy hurdles?" And he'd put like a dowel stick, just he balanced it on like a box or something like that, and he was doing some jumps over it. He's like, and I was like, because someone's packaged it really nicely together, and it looks sellable, and you have this flashy piece of equipment that you're like, well, I've got to use it. I did a post a while ago about hurdles and how people have no idea how to space them. They always jump over them the wrong way.
Yeah.
And believe me, I've seen 2 athletes have really bad ankle injuries from standing on the top of a mini hurdle and then it reflexing back off and them spraining their ankle because of it. So what it does for me is it drives the external stimulus being the outcome goal rather than the quality of the ground-based or the quality of the landing being the goal. So it also becomes a thing as well where, let's say you've got 10 athletes. Do they all need 10 different hurdle spacings? Potentially. And are you going to rearrange them? Have you got 10 sets of 10 hurdles? So I just say, just get rid of them. Just get rid of them. Use the ground to elicit that stimulus, which is more force, more speed. But the number one thing that you require for a plyometric landing is either gravity or it's velocity into that movement. And obviously you can get that from gravity. Instead of using a box, why don't you jump into the air? Using your own, what I class as self-selected fall height. So if you jump into the air, when you land on that next landing, you've selected how high you're going to jump into the air. The likelihood that you've selected correctly is probably much more reliable than a coach pushing you off of a certain box.
Yeah.
If they say, "Oh, I reckon you're about 45 centimeters and ready for that," are they? Who knows? Have you got loads of data to support that? Okay, fair enough. If you do, great. I'd rather have a 12, 13-year-old athlete come up to me and say, right, cool, we're just going to jump on the spot. Let's allow you to regulate how high you're jumping. That's going to give you a certain amount of force on the next landing. And then we're going to use that as a way to monitor what you're doing. If you overcook it in the first one, you're probably going to go, okay, cool. Right, let me go back. Let me start it again. I see it all the time with triple jumpers. They run in too hard. They do a hop and they go, oh, okay, that's too fast.
Yeah.
I'm gonna regulate that myself. Okay, I'm gonna chill it down 10%. Come in. Okay, now I can use that force and I can move through that movement. So self-regulation is a really powerful tool in what I class my form of plyometrics as locomotive plyometrics. It's moving in space. It's not using an external stimulus to elicit those ground reaction forces.
So I don't know if sometimes it's a bit of a crutch, isn't it? Because the people maybe not knowing the technical side of what they're trying to achieve as much. You put hurdles out because this is now our target without actually thinking about what we're actually trying to achieve. The same with a box, isn't it? I'm jumping on that box height rather than thinking about what are we actually doing this for.
Yeah, it's very much a case of people won't dive into the education of it and the literature and really understanding the training method. You know, everyone's got all the gym-based squatting, deadlifting, technical bits. People have done it 1,000 times over, but plyometrics is difficult to dig into, to figure out yourself, to I guess build your own education around it. And that's one of the number one reasons why I put together the course, because I wanted to give people a tool to go back to all the time and say, you know, you can just use ground-based movement and it can really develop an athlete over, you know, 5 to 8 years. I honestly don't feel like you need to bring in a box until someone is really kind of at the elite end and we're like looking for new ways to bring about a stimulus.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Because ultimately velocity is, if you run in over 10 meters and then try to hop on a single leg, I can guarantee you 90% of the population of athletes that you train cannot do 3 hops in a row that look any good. And it's like, should that be a really fundamental skill that like 90% of athletes should be able to do? But the problem is 90% of coaches don't know how to coach it. They don't know what they're looking for. So like you say, they chuck in a hurdle and then it all goes to pot then. Like what do you expect them to do? They can't do it on the flat. So why are you chucking a hurdle in there? Oh, well, it's going to regulate well, it's not, because they can't do it anyway. Can't handle those forces.
Yeah, no, 100%. The other thing from like videos like yours that you put out and others that where you see true plyometrics is the intent that goes behind the movements, isn't it? You see some people going through the motions when they're doing things like hopping, and you're like, you're probably not getting what you're intending to get out of that. Whereas when you watch someone truly putting that intent behind the exercise, it's a big difference, isn't it? And that's maybe what is missing in terms of a coach's education is coaching that intent and what we're actually trying to get out of the exercise.
Yeah, there's a real kind of barrier and crossover, and that I think sits at around about 3.5 to 4 times body weight, and people will sit behind that safe zone at like 2.5 to 3, and that's where they feel is their like their limit of intent, and they won't creep past that. So they'll sit at, you know, more basic kind of pogo leaps where they're just leaping on the spot. When you start to bring in things like hopping on one leg, that's when you're starting to push to like 4.5, 5 times body weight. So people shy away from trying to coach it, teach it, and actually do it as an athlete. And where that crossover comes in is where you have to start being quite, I call it being quite violent with the floor. You've got to start attacking this thing, because if you don't, you're going to land and then think, well, now I've got to try and do something, when we want you to be effectively striking the ground underneath you. And yeah, like I said before, being quite violent with it.
Yeah, 100%. Matt, I wanted to pull from your background of football, of playing, and taking your knowledge now. And if you were to be coaching Matt back then and preparing him for football, what would be maybe some of the differences or tweaks you make to your preparation?
I think that I would, number one, I would not do as much kind of aerobic volume, and I would concentrate so much more on the speed and dynamic side of training. And that's not just because I'm at that end of the kind of coaching continuum of I'm up at this speed stuff and there's coaches down doing more aerobic based conditioning stuff. It's because every season I would get to the first 2, 3, 4, 5 games, and the only thing that was getting me in shape was playing 90 minutes of football.
Yeah.
So assuming that that was going to help me every year, get me in great shape, it's just not looking at the demands of the sport and seeing that I did so. It's just so hard to mimic what you're doing in that period of time. So why not work on being more dynamic, being being better in terms of a high frequency of repeatability of a certain type of thing. So whether it's being able to do higher intensity sprints, but doing a high volume of those, building that up over a period of time. I think once you build in a bit more of a speed reserve, you can start to understand that, okay, I know that within football, I'm probably going to be ambling around at about 65 to 75% for honestly about 90, 85% of the game. There really isn't that much of a high intensity in terms of, your maximum speed or whatever. But I know that if I work on my max speed, that 65 or 75% is going to be better than the next guy's. If my maximum is if my out and out speed is quicker than yours, my 65, 70% is going to be quicker than yours. That's where I feel like I would have done a lot more. And it quickly showed when I moved into more track and field based stuff, because of how much quicker and more dynamic I got within such a short period of time when I left behind a lot of just going on runs. I think, why was I going on a run? What was I gaining out of that? Is it just like a tick box in my head? It's like the old traditional stuff for boxers. They've got to feel like they've got to get out and run on the road. Is it more of an emotional kind of regulation to be like, yeah, I'm getting fit, but actually I need to be looking more at the specific demands of what I'm doing regularly in the game. I played centre half when I was a footballer, and I was quite a dominant player in the air. Would have working on jumping benefited me even more. It could have done. Would have. I always look at it as well that I struggled with acceleration and like a turn and change of pace sort of thing. So it might be in like the first kind of 2, 3, or 4 steps. I always struggled to like turn a corner and then sprint and things like that. That's where I think I would have made my money, really doing a lot more of that stuff. And it showed actually when I moved then into basketball and into track and field. I had to work a lot more on my like static explosiveness. Once I'm upright and I'm moving, I was pretty effective at top speed. But it took me a while to get there. And I think that would have been a lot more valuable because, ironically, football is very short. There's not many times where you do sprint for 50 meters. Very, very rarely. So that's where I think I would seen most value if I was to coach my younger self now.
I think to add on to what you were saying about getting fit through football, which I fully agree with, is the fact that at a certain level, I don't think you look at many players once they've played a few games and think they're gassed, they're struggling with their aerobic fitness. There obviously is going to be a few, but that's where we seem to focus so much time. Whereas we do probably point out a lot of players were like, yeah, they don't change direction quick enough. They're not quick enough off the mark. And like you say, that's a massive area that you can be working on where it's essentially being used for something else, where I don't really feel like there's too many players that will actually benefit from it, because generally fitness levels are pretty good, aren't they? And they're going to get better from playing.
Yeah, it's aerobic fitness as well. Like season to season, you're not going to lose much. No. You're really not. Your speed, on the other hand, is going to plummet. Like 2-3 weeks, if you don't top up on speed stuff, you lose it. Yeah. Strength stuff, you'll keep it.
Yeah.
You might be a bit sore if you didn't lift for 6 months and then try to lift, but I can guarantee you, like 1 RM basic strength, you're not going to be far off of it. You keep those qualities. Aerobic capacity is so easy to keep ticking over, but speed, being dynamic, being explosive, you've got to train it. You've got to keep those in there. You've got to dose it throughout the season, even if it's the smallest amount, to keep that there. Otherwise, when the championship crunch time comes, you start to tail off and you're plateauing or even getting worse. What does that say?
Yeah.
I mean, talking to my friends aren't any, in terms of sports performance and stuff. They're like, oh, Henderson, he just loses his legs and stuff at certain points in the game. And I'm like, you could look at it and say, repeatability of being able to change direction effectively later on in the game. Is he not doing that sort of training? He could argue 1,000 other things as well, but if you were to look at it purely in that given, what he's done previously to it, could that be a way for him to get back to playing deeper into games and being effective at that stage? That could be it. That it could definitely be it. Yeah, it's unfortunately, we've in every sport, it doesn't matter what sport you go into, there's always that we continue to train the same way because we've always done it, and that's the way that it's always worked. You're never going to get rid of that kind of hero feeling of, the harder we train, in terms of, if we're feeling like we're working hard, then we're gonna win. When actually being smarter and actually doing high percentage stuff could be the winning formula to it.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted a bit of a fun topic now, because off the back of the World Cup, obviously there's been some incredible performances from teams, but individually, and the speed of some of these players now is pretty scary. But I just wanted to get your sort of technical views on players like Mbappe. Obviously, the speed is a massive part of his game, but there's a lot of quick players that are nowhere near as effective. So what is it that jumps out for you straight away, like in terms of areas that you notice where that is a big difference from him to someone else who's probably equally, if not a little bit slower, but up there in terms of speed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember again, watching the England game with a few of the lads, and the big thing was, I'm sure there was a moment where Mbappe was taken on Kyle Walker, and they're like, Kyle Walker's quick, and Kyle Walker's kind of in line with Mbappe. Mbappe's got the ball at his feet. Again, it comes back to speed reserve. Mbappe's not running at 100% in that given moment because he has to control the ball.
Yeah.
So his speed reserve is better. Like he is faster than Kyle Walker in that given moment in the game. It might not be, if they were to line up a track and do a 100-meter sprint or whatever, that he might be faster in that moment. But I'm sure it was towards the second half where there was that moment where they were chasing each other down the bylines, and speed reserve is obviously something that Mbappe's got in him. He seemed pretty good deep into the game in terms of being able to carry the ball at speed, and I think that's why he was effective at what he's doing. Obviously, the skills with being able to handle a ball at that speed, like he's not, let's say in that given moment, it was probably 100% of what he could handle at that time in the game. You've got to do that stuff. You've got to work with the ball at very high speeds to see a crossover. You can't see there being a large crossover if Usain Bolt is to step onto a football pitch and you're to assume that he's going to be, the greatest footballer ever because he's so fast. Well, no, he needs that specific skill set at that specific speed. And I also think that someone like Cristiano Ronaldo in his prime was really effective because of the way that he ran. He doesn't have a high carryover, and I think a low swinging carry of a sprint is really effective because you constantly knock the ball. So it's like those sort of small nuances. Like he wouldn't necessarily step onto a track and be that effective at racing, a world-class sprinter, because they are building their technical model purely around physics. Obviously, what fits their body, but Cristiano Ronaldo has found a niche in that he can be effective at carrying the ball as well as being fast at the same time amongst those players around him. Is it just so happened to be that the kind of stars aligned and that his technique was like that anyway, and that fit perfectly to how you would carry a ball? Things like that you have to consider, being a little bit of kind of nature nurture sort of stuff. But I found Mbappe was, his transition from acceleration into top speed was really effective. There are some guys that are really good at like the first kind of 5 or 10 yards, and you might see them burst past the player, and then it's kind of like them making then a decision. But I feel like he has an ever building kind of speed where he transitions then into upright running, and you're like, oh shit, he's still shifting at this point. And I think that adds a lot of value with attacking players. It might not add as much value for like a central midfielder, they're going to be a lot of short changes of direction where, you know, the first 5 or 10 yards is where they're most effective. When you've got wide players or players up top, I think that transitional acceleration into upright running, that's where you're going to make your money. Obviously, you need to be fast in acceleration, but to carry past those other players, I think that transitional speed is really, really important.
I suppose that's where you've got the space on the pitch as well, like you mentioned, in comparison to the central midfielder. And then there's the other side of it, which is like the insight, isn't it? The game insight. Like that is one thing I noticed from him, is that he's moving before the actions even happened. He's noticing things before it's even happening a lot of the time, which gives him that little bit of space, which he doesn't even really need, because he's, like you mentioned, he's so quick in acceleration and up into top speed. So it was a fascinating watch, watching players like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's good. It's really, really good. It's well, and like I always like the little moments that come out that are kind of seen as kind of athletic feats. Who was the lad? Was it the Moroccan lad that went for a header, and then like, everyone's like analysing how high he jumped and all this sort of stuff, and people have analysed Ronaldo before and how high he jumps, and then I'm like, yeah, like I get it, it's impressive, and but it's cool to pick those bits out, and then people ask me like, why is he effective or what he's doing and stuff. So yeah, it's Mbappe's going to be a special player over the next 4 years, I think.
So
I would just like to see him leave the French leagues and actually come to a proper league.
definitely. You just mentioned there about those insights, though. I think they're really important to highlight, because that, for me, is what talks a player's language. Because when you're trying to speak to a player about the importance of plyometrics, and it is a Ronaldo type player or an attacking type player, and you take that clip of the header, even though it's one instance in a game and one moment, that suddenly makes sense to the player, doesn't it? So it is really important to highlight that, and in different positions as well, because that's something I want to bring up in a little bit, is how you'd go around dealing with different types of players. Maybe something we can tackle now, actually, and then we'll go back to some of the other stuff I have planned. And with that in mind, like I've spoken to people about this before, you've got your quick players, your attacking players, like your Mbappes, your Ronaldos, but obviously not all at that level. But then you've very much got your technical players, like maybe that playing in a different position. How would your approach differ between the two?
I think similar to what I mentioned before, you're like, one of my favorite players ever is Paul Scholes. His ability to effectively change direction. I think the phrase you'll see in football is more like turning on a dime and just being able to open up the pitch in ways that you're like, shit, like I can't even, when I receive the ball like that, I don't even assume that there's space in how it is. And there's always like a football brain thought to it, where like, oh, he just sees things like that. And obviously all these parts link together, and he's effective at what he does because he sees things differently. He's got the knowledge to know where certain players are because of the previous play and all this sort of stuff. But also he has the physical ability to change direction like that, to turn how he does. So if I'm looking at more centrally based people that are in the thick of stuff, I will have them work on more multi-directional based skills, whether it's landing and takeoff based stuff, whether it's, you know, shorter agility based change of direction stuff, but giving them the ability to be kind of explosive out of short steps, and being able to, so when you're taking a turn and trying to beat an opponent and to find space, just 1 or 2 steps is enough to sometimes open that part of that play up, so that you can make a pass to move the ball up the pitch into a different sequence of play. And I found that there are often some really decent players that are talked about, and I noticed it when I was playing football as well. You're like, they're really technically gifted, but always seems to be the bigger guys. You know, you play like a Sunday league football thing. These guys are really effective at what they do. Like, they're quite technically good. But as soon as there's a turn of play where they have to open things up and be kind of dynamic in that given second, and then get the ball out of their feet quickly, you're like, shit, they always miss that chance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of that, I think. You create massive space in the tiniest portions of time. I think it's like a split second. It's like a tenth, 2/10 of a second, where you've changed play. Someone's taken a wrong step and you've moved past them. And then you're like, shit, there's that given moment for us to now create something. So that's where I like to focus on basic kind of being able to rotate well, being able to change direction in a frontal plane, and also being able really good with braking action, we do a ton of in plyometrics. Are you able to move into space, being able to brake and then come back out of that movement? I think is really valuable for those sort of central players. Now I also look at like different body types if you were to swing out to like out towards more kind of lateral wide base players. And I always I always like to kind of look at those guys and think like what you do sometimes get slight differences in players, and I do think the game is sort of kind of shifting towards, you do see a lot more like Carl Walker based kind of players, especially playing at like right back and left back, that are just strong lads that are obviously fitted well to play against someone like Mbappe who's fast and powerful and strong and stuff. But you've also got this kind of whip it up and down the flanks that are type of lads that will just run all day. They're never going to have an ounce of fat on them, sort of thing, but they're just light, dynamic, kind of elastic guys. And I think I find a lot of value in training a lot more sub-maximal, higher volume based elastic stuff. It's like I love doing like long periods of bounds with those sort of athletes, kind of very, very dynamic, kind of bilateral, horizontal base, kind of broad jumping stuff. Obviously, they have to still have that ability to change direction well, but you find that because they sit a lot more in that flank, they do a lot more linear up and down kind of motion. So I tap into that. Like I'll go more into that sort of stuff. Teach them how to hop well on one leg. Teach them how to bound well. And it might be that I would do a little bit more curved base running as opposed to so much change of direction. And you know, if I look at if I was to look at position specific stuff, they're all going to get all of those, you know, all of the components that we'll speak about, whether it's change of direction, agility, how much forward based, frontal plane, linear, backwards pedaling stuff. They'll all get some of that. It's just how much you give a percentage of that to a certain given position. And I think that's a really easy way to like bucket groups of players.
Yeah.
I always see this as well, is that I think a centre half needs to train like a centre forward does. Like I think if you're facing a centre forward, why would you not want to be dynamic like a centre forward? It's always you put the slow lad at the back. It's always like as soon as you come up through the school ranks and stuff, you think, where's the slowest player? You'll probably point, other than being the keeper, the centre half, sometimes maybe a centre mid. You never really see that many dynamic centre mid players. And obviously people gravitate to their positions as to their kind of body type and all this sort of stuff. But why not train these guys to be fast like the strikers are? So I think that's really an effective way in terms of grouping athletes. So yeah, you just look at what those key variables are and see how much of a percentage you might do of forward linear sprinting as opposed to more agility or change of direction as opposed to more curve based running. Or, you know, that could be also fit towards where you might fit certain plyometrics.
I love what you've spoke about before around there not being like a specific sort of matrix or a spectrum of training, that you move along it and that you focus on different areas, that you focus on it all at different times. I think that's great because we very much get in the mindset, and maybe it's from movement quality stuff and getting ready for strength training that a lot of clubs have that in mind, which I think is great. But from the stuff that you spoke around plyometrics, I think it's really important to highlight that. So can you touch on that a little bit? Because I don't feel like I've done that justice at all, but you know what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, so the typical model is what's seen as like the plyometric progression model, where you start at A and you finish at Z or whatever it might be. And because of the, like, reiterating what we were speaking about with the boxes and not using hurdles and an external stimulus, how I see it is that you have a group of movements, and there are only a certain group of movements that you can do, and you have those movements all the time within your program. But it just you undulate how much of that movement you do, the intensity of the movement that you use, and the volume that you use in a given part in the season. If you've got a game on a Saturday, the likelihood is that your plyometric session on a Thursday is not going to be crazy intensive, and you're going to be doing hops for speed or whatever. You're going to be touching on just keeping things, excited and stimulated in a way that prepares you for the game. But, deep in the off season, you're going to be working more on those higher intensity based movements. So going back to the progression comes from, how do we get to depth jumps? How do we get to falling off of boxes? Because it's the most intense form of plyometrics that we can do, kind of in inverted commas. And where I see the problem with that is we quickly get to a performance ceiling. We quickly hit that performance ceiling. Number one is because I don't think coaches are effective enough at coaching all the bits that lead up to those typical progressions that we see. We just see, okay, that athlete can do that, cool, we'll do a bit of that and we move on to the next part. Whereas as soon as an athlete can learn how to bilaterally move on 2 feet, to move to the next step up in intensity, which is a split bilateral stance, and then an exchanging bilateral stance, and then into single leg movement, which is a bound from right to left, and then the most intense form of movement is a hop, where you're hopping just on one single leg continuously. Once you've nailed those drills or movements or exercises, whatever you want to call them, you just improve the skill and quality of that movement, and that will elicit higher speeds, higher ground reaction forces, which will create larger adaptations. And these skills, if you want to get better at these movements, the physical qualities will come quickly, and the skill domains will slowly build over periods of time. What I mean by skill domain is, are you able to hit the ground with a hop? Let's say you're running in, as I mentioned before, over 10 meters, and then you're trying to repeatedly hop on one leg. It takes an enormous demand of skill to understand how much force you're about to receive on that single leg at such a speed. So you have to be able to anticipate the ground, so pre-activate musculature before you hit the ground. You have to stabilize in a much faster rate as to what you were to do if you were to do it from a static position. You've got to couple that energy effectively. You've got to use that energy, and you've got to get out the other end of it. These are all skills. When people talk about things like stiffness, being as stiff as you can on the ground, what I'm intrigued by not necessarily is the tissue stiffness, but the joint stiffness. All of the components singing together at the same time. That to me is a skill. That is a neurological pattern that says, I have to switch on this muscle, this muscle, this muscle. This tendon's going to do this. This is going to be in this position. I'm going to understand that if my body's slightly off and tilted to the side, if my foot's off in this position, I'll make those corrections. These are all neuromuscular skill-driven components. And unfortunately, this takes a few years for you to start to get effective at that. But once you start to do ground-based plyometrics over a period of years, and you use, those 4 or 5 movements in all these different forms of intensity, at different levels of a kind of spectrum of kind of, as I said, the intensity scale of it being rudimentary, kind of sub-maximal, maximal, or even kind of in a more yielding kind of outside the plyometric domain. Once you're doing that year on year, and you're just doing small doses of it at certain times in the year and larger doses at other times, 5 years down the line, you have a completely different athlete.
Yeah.
And like polar opposites of the spectrum. You've got someone that, okay, just a typical footballer, as opposed to someone that you start to go, shit, they're an athlete as well as a footballer. They're not just seen as a footballer. This guy can move.
Yeah, 100%. With that in mind, I was going to ask as well, and I know that you've talked about a lot of the intricacies working with different people, positions, even type of player, body types, and it goes on and on and on. So I know that the answer to this is probably it depends. But if we were to say there's certain exercises or drills to keep him throughout a season, bearing in mind that we will fluctuate on how much we do and all the rest of it, where would your mind go to with that? Is there going to be certain ones that come to the forefront?
The best phrase ever from my mentor is hopping never leaves the program. So one-legged hopping, where you're propelling yourself right. At any given point in the season, you are doing a small dosage of hopping.
Yeah.
And that for me is when you've learned how to hop, obviously, if you can't hop and you haven't tried it, don't start hopping all year long. You need to develop the skills to be able to hop.
Yeah.
But once you know how to hop and you're effectively able to, do multiple sets of it, come out the back end of a session, not feel like you've ran a marathon, you understand the intensity of hopping. When you come away from it and say you just reintroduce it 6 months later, you go, oh shit, the speed of this movement. Because when you're hopping on a single limb, in order for you to continue to stand up and to move, you've got to swing that leg through at twice the speed as what you would be doing when you bound. You are really cycling that leg through. And you can't hide in hopping because that leg is about to slam into the ground again and again and again. You can't get away from those high reaction forces. And it keeps that stimulus there. It keeps that understanding there. If people can find kind of similar scenarios with things like let's say you've done a big block of back squatting or some heavy training, and let's say you got to a stage where you're like, okay, cool. When I put 100 kilos on my back, it just feels easy now. If you go away from that for 6 months, you come back to it, you put 100 kilos on your back, you go, oh shit, I have not done this in a long time. It's that same sort of feeling, but tenfold with dynamic movement. So hopping is number one for me. All day long, never leaves the program. Bilateral leaping as well is also pretty preferable because I find the bilateral leaping, or pogos, whatever you want to call it, is a segue into all other movements. You'll start with bilateral movements and you'll end up at hopping. So you're probably going to use leaping as well as hopping year long. And for me, that's gold. If you can do a bit of hopping, now's your perfect start, right? Beginning of the new year.
Yeah.
If you do a little bit of hopping now, see what you're like this time, January 2024, if you hop, let's say once a week, every week for the rest of this year. Tell me how much you've changed in that given time.
Yeah, it's a challenge right there. But just off the back of that then, so that's something that can stay in the program all year round. If we have a window of opportunity, whether it's a games postponed or off season or whatever it is, where would you go to then?
Are you talking about like where within a week, like where?
Yeah. Yeah. So if we maybe had a couple of weeks and it was like a window of opportunity, we can really take advantage of this. Obviously, we've got that the hops and the bilateral bounds in throughout the season. That's something that we're sort of sprinkling throughout the season. But this is an opportunity now. Where would you go with that?
Obviously, it's dependent on the type of week that you've got. Let's say that you're doing 2 or 3 S&C sessions a week. You could just, I have a lot of, excuse me, I have a lot of guys that do a plyo session before they lift. And it works really well. Some people just can't handle that intensity of doing that sort of bout of work and then lifting. If you are doing pitch-based stuff 2 or 3, 4 times a week and you're lifting a couple times a week, you could say, well, I'm going to take those 2 larger plyometric sessions and I'm going to split them up. And let's say that you're doing high speed running on one day, or you're doing a lot of like breakaway plays. You could prime that with some upright, like bounding, relaxed bounding, something that's going to prep me ready for that. If you're doing some heavy lifting, you could be doing some more intense bilateral, maximal stuff for height. If you're doing a recovery session, you could then prime that with lots of really rudimentary high volume lower leg stuff. And that's gonna really aid in terms of kind of flushing the lower leg. You're gonna put the lower extremities through high volume stuff. It's gonna probably support things like tendon health. And then it could be that, let's say you're doing more metabolic stuff, add in some more yielding, deeper range based jumping actions. Something that's going to challenge posture, stability at those deeper ranges, and find ways in which you can see similarities. Some people use similarities as a way to program it. Some people flip that and they'll do opposites.
Yeah.
And there is no right or right or wrong way to do it. It's finding time in your program too. So don't feel like you have to do, start a session here, finish a session here, done. Plyometrics done. 3 days later, you do the same. I think exposure over a period of time, like a week, even if you did 5 sessions, 7 sessions, whatever, a little bit is still equal to doing a couple of sessions. You can still get that stimulus to the body. The body is, like I said, is exposed to that stimulus over that period of time. It will reset over those coming days after you've done that. And then you again then look to dig into maybe the same stimulus, something a bit more, something a bit less, depending on where you're at and what that time of period of time within the season is looking like.
Brilliant. Great information that. Matt, I want to be respectful of your time. I want to move on to some of the quick fire questions that we finished the podcast with. The first of which I ask everyone, who've been some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
I mean, my mentor is everything in terms of that. My mentor Eric was my coach, my track coach, has really become it's become kind of a, call it a father figure, but it's someone that I've found. I have a constant flow of conversation, and he challenges me all the time with new thoughts, new ideas. It's just really, if I'll ask him a question and he won't give me the answer all the time. He'll tell me where to look for it, why I should be looking for it in this place. And he constantly looks to develop himself as a guy in his mid-70s, and it's kind of really awe-inspiring for me to look at someone like that, and he still does plyos. Can't beat that. which I love. That's like an ultimate goal, is to do plyos, way into my 70s. So yeah, ultimately he's the number one influence. It's tough to look at anyone else really. Also have another previous coach. His name's James. He's an S&C coach. Works for Saints. And he was my S&C coach when I was at university. Again, another real someone that's challenged me a lot. Has not kind of been an echo chamber to me, but has been a real, I'll throw caution to the wind sort of thing, and he'll always rein me back in and be like, yeah, but have you thought about this and this and this? So it's, I could look at people that I don't know as well, but I just don't think that they ever influence me as much as the people that I communicate with week in, week out. And people ask me about my mentor Eric all the time, and I've had a conversation over email with him every week for 13, 14 years. That's constant, whether it's chit chat or whether it's we're digging into research. What are the implications of this? So yeah, that's who inspires me.
And what would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
I think not taking the standard route of a performance coach or physical prep coach. I think that's been a really unique way that it gives me a perspective that's really outside of the norm. If I'm working with S&C coaches and I'll put something to them, and they'll be like, wow, they see so much within a gym setting, and I see so much within, I can coach performance with no equipment and anywhere. I think that helps me within my niche, and it also helps me, just to see from a different perspective.
Definitely. We've spoke about training younger Matt. But
Yeah.
if you could speak to younger Matt and career-wise and give some career advice, what would that top bit of career advice be?
Be patient. My goodness. I'm so I don't know whether it's like a good thing and a torturous thing. Like I'll do something and then I'll be like, right, what's next? Just let it be. Let something do what it wants to do. Like I think I fill my time with too much, and I almost need to get rid of 90% of things, focus on one thing
Yeah.
really effectively. Allow it to, if it's educational, whether it's programs, whatever, just allow it to do what you want it to do, rather than being like, right, done, next thing.
Yeah.
I'm so impatient like that. And my daughter finds out quickly as well that I'm impatient in that, and like she's going to become impatient because of it. So I'm like, no, I need to be yeah, just a little bit more present in what I've done or achieved, or what I've set out to complete, and then look at it in a bit more detail, maybe go back through it, see if I can improve it. And, obviously I do those things, but yeah, just be better at that.
And last one, mate. What is your approach to CPD, continue learning? How do you go about that? Obviously, you've talked about mentors and influences and inspirations, but how do you go about continually improving?
I speak to a lot of people. I have conversations with people a lot, and I also ask a lot of questions.
Mm.
Not to be afraid of asking questions, and yeah, not being afraid to just speak to people that you sometimes you think, oh man, they're never going to speak to me. The last 2 years have taught me that is a complete lie.
Yeah.
I've spoken to some people where they just give you something, and it's like solves like world hunger in your mind of problems. It's like that much of value. You're like, wow, I just didn't see that like that. And having that conversation just it's like conquered X, Y, and Z of all these issues that I've had within my programming, and yeah, I think it's it's been my mentorship. It's been conversations. I I've not done that much kind of professional course development myself. I've done so much more personal investigation because of a flow of conversation with my mentor,
Mm.
challenging things, asking questions, setting aside my own goals to dig into something and say, well, what do I need to get there? Well, I need to speak to this person and ask them about that and see how I can bring things together. If you can't quite suss that out yourself, I think it's a case of speaking to someone that can give you a bit of a guideline to how you might go about doing that. But once you kind of get into a bit of a groove of it, I think it's a really effective way to learn. Um, courses are great, but you get so much more out of speaking to someone.
Yeah, definitely. No, that seems to be the key answer from that question as well. So it's a common theme, but it's there because it's so important. People need to listen to that and take action on it. Matt, that's been absolutely incredible, mate. Thank you very much for coming on. We've gone just over the hour, so I hope I've not kept you over time, but I really appreciate you coming on. I think there's been some great content in there for people. Just to finish us up, if people want to keep in touch with what you've got going on with the business and just the content you put out, where would you send them?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much, by the way, for having me on. Sorry, my voice is like slowly dying towards the end of the conversation. I realized how much I talk. But yeah, they can, a lot of my kind of communication or stuff that I put out is on Instagram, and that's McInnes Watson, McInnes Watson, or Plus Flyers, which is our business. And you can go to plusplyers.com and find out all of our kind of resources, whether it's programs, educational stuff. But yeah, send me a message on Instagram if you want to chat or learn about something. Yeah, and that's most where I am. Twitter, I just can't suss out, so I just leave it.
Perfect, mate. Yeah, go and give Matt a follow because some great stuff over on there. And Matt, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks so much. Cheers. Have a good one.